Usually when we think about construction, there is this expectation of just cold, hard math.
Oh, totally. It is very calculated, very binary.
Right, you look at a skyscraper and the blueprints show the load-bearing walls and like the steel beams, and the structural engineer just points and says, there it is, physics.
Yeah, physics and gravity. I mean, we really like things to be tangible and measurable.
Exactly. Steel, concrete, gravity. It seems perfectly clean. But step into the actual process of getting those buildings off the ground, and that precision just kind of vanishes.
It really does. It disappears completely.
We are looking at a multi-billion-dollar industry that actually runs on an invisible, highly emotional currency. It is like the absolute definition of a shadow economy of trust.
That is a massive shadow economy.
And that is exactly what we are dissecting today in this deep dive. We are going to explore how human emotions secretly drive billion-dollar decisions and how a person's reputation functions as this entire shadow economy.
Plus, how the everyday language we use acts as the invisible cement holding project sites together. And really, that applies to any team.
So true. And before we get too far into the weeds, I think we should set the stage for you listening right now.
Right. Because while the research we are looking at is deeply rooted in the construction industry, I want you to keep your own workplace in mind today.
Yeah, these insights are incredibly universal.
They really are.
Yeah.
I mean, we live in a corporate world that is just obsessed with data, right? With metrics and key performance indicators and spreadsheets.
We love a good spreadsheet.
We do. But understanding these hidden dynamics of trust is what actually helps us navigate our careers. It explains why some projects, soar and why others completely stall out.
Even when they have all the supposedly correct data.
Exactly. The data might be perfect, but the project still fails.
Which is wild, because we like to think that the biggest decisions in business, like, say, awarding a massive construction contract, are made in boardrooms by purely rational people.
Right, people just staring at spreadsheets and being completely objective.
Yeah, exactly. But the findings tell a very different story. The myth of the purely rational client is really just that. It's a myth.
It is. I mean, the client genuinely believes they are deciding based on evaluation criteria and numbers. They really do.
That they aren't.
No. To understand what is actually happening in that boardroom, we have to look at Daniel Kahneman's work on the human mind.
Oh, the Nobel Prize winner.
That's the one. He won it for mapping out the divide between our fast, intuitive thinking, which he calls System 1, and our slow, analytical thinking.
Which is System 2.
Exactly. System 2 is the slow, deliberate part of your brain.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because I think we have all experienced the split in our own lives, right?
Oh, for sure. Every day.
It is kind of like buying a house or even a used car. You have the mechanical inspection report right in front of you.
You have the Kelly Blue Book value.
Right, so that slow analytical part of your brain, your System 2, is crunching the numbers. But ultimately, you make a gut decision based on the vibe of the seller.
Yes, the vibe check is real.
It really is. If the seller seems shady, you walk away, even if the math is perfect. But why does the brain just throw out the math when the stakes get high like that?
Well, it comes down to basic biology and risk management. When financial risk is high, and, in construction, we are talking about astronomical sums of money.
Millions or even billions of dollars.
Exactly. So cortisol and stress just flood the bloodstream. The human brain desperately requires emotional safety to counteract that stress.
So it's a literal physical reaction.
It is. That biological need for safety physically overrides the analytical data of System 2. The numbers, the spreadsheets, the weighted criteria, they often just become the post hoc rationalization.
Right, really? It's just a rationalization.
Yeah, they become the rational justification for a decision that was already born in instinct. The brain decides it feels safe, and then it frantically looks for the data to back up that feeling.
So the data isn't actually driving the car. It is just sitting in the passenger seat holding the map.
That is a perfect way to put it.
There is this incredible story in the research from a professional named Fernando, right? He has seen this exact scenario play out countless times in these high-stakes meetings.
Fernando's observations are fascinating.
He talks about seeing an excellent, incredibly cheap quotation get flat-out rejected simply because the contractor, in his words, does not inspire trust.
And conversely, Fernando notes that a significantly more expensive bid can actually win the contract.
Which makes no financial sense.
None at all. Not on paper. But they win, not because the math makes sense, but because the contractor had like a calm tone of voice in the meeting.
A calm tone of voice. Millions of dollars decided by a calm tone of voice.
Or they provided a really positive verbal reference. Or maybe they just told a highly relatable story at the exact right moment.
Just to lower that stress response.
Exactly, to lower that stress response in the client's brain.
It is just wild to think about a multi-million-dollar margin being decided by a well-timed story. But I guess just like in the marketplace of friendship, trust cannot be bought with a lower price tag.
No, it can't. Like friendship, it has to be earned through those micro interactions.
But that introduces a massive complication, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Because if the client is making gut-driven choices just to feel safe, the contractor sitting across the table is forced into this terrifying psychological corner.
They are absorbing all of that subjective pressure. It is intense.
They are living in this state of constant psychological split. On one hand, they have this intense fear of failing, and on the other hand, a desperate desire to prove their worth.
It is exhausting.
So when they sit across from the client, they project solidity and reliability. But the moment they turn around to deal with their own subcontractors, the roles flip.
They become the evaluator.
Right. Trying to ruthlessly balance cost and risk to protect their own margins. Awarding these contracts is fundamentally a psychology of fear.
Fear is the driving factor. The fear of losing the job. The fear of not delivering on time.
And the fear of trusting someone completely unknown.
Exactly. And the industry has actually tried to fix this fear with procurement systems.
Oh, the algorithms.
Yes, we have these massive algorithms and scoring tables that are specifically designed to strip the human intuition out entirely.
To replace it with objective numbers.
Right. But those systems fail to eliminate the human element. Because behind every algorithm, behind every weighted criterion on a scoring table, there is a human being.
A human deciding how much each factor should count.
Exactly. People still choose the weights.
This is where Francis Fukuyama's philosophy comes into focus in the research, and it feels so relevant here.
Fukuyama's work is brilliant on this.
He argues that the entire modern economy rests on an invisible moral base of social trust. But, if we have airtight legal contracts and strict procurement laws, why do we even need social trust?
Because contracts cannot possibly cover every single edge case in reality.
They just can't predict everything.
Right. If we had to legislate, monitor, and litigate every single micro-interaction between a contractor and a supplier, the transaction costs would skyrocket.
It would just be too expensive to function.
It would completely freeze the global economy. Nothing would ever get built. Trust is what lubricates the friction of the unknown.
So without it, the legal and bureaucratic weight just collapses the system.
Precisely. And no one feels the weight of that system more than the subcontractor at the very end of the chain.
The people doing the actual labor.
Yes. The findings describe their reality as living under constant scrutiny. It is like a permanent scoring contest.
Where every single mistake, every minor delay just chips away at their invisible credibility rating.
In an environment like that, the word reputation is literally worth more than a signed contract.
Which brings in Mark Granovetter's theory of social networks, right?
Yes. Granovetter explains that it is actually our weak ties that generate the most opportunities for us.
Weak ties, meaning not our close friends.
Right. A strong tie is your best friend or your immediate coworker. You already share the exact same information silo.
So you aren't learning anything new from them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But a weak tie is like a friend of a friend. They act as a bridge to an entirely different network.
Bringing in fresh information and new opportunities.
In the construction world, this translates into informal recommendations, last-minute phone calls, and alliances built entirely on shared memory.
Okay, I have to push back on this a little bit.
Sure, go ahead.
Because if a multi-million-dollar industry relies this heavily on weak ties and informal back-channel recommendations instead of, objective algorithms, doesn't that make the entire system incredibly fragile?
I can see why it looks that way.
Not to mention biased. It sounds like an old boys club where who you know trumps what you can actually do.
That is a very natural concern, and honestly, it's a valid critique of network reliance.
Right.
But if we look at the underlying mechanics of why this happens, it is actually the opposite of fragile. Rather than making the system weak, these networks act as a highly evolved form of risk mitigation.
Risk mitigation. Through friends of friends.
Yeah. Think about it. A blind algorithm only knows what was inputted on a Tuesday morning. It does not know how a subcontractor behaves when a site floods at 3 in the morning on a Sunday.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Social memory does know that.
Exactly. The informal network carries the nuance of past behavior. reliability under extreme stress, behavioral standard that a spreadsheet simply cannot capture.
So it's not just about who you know, it is about who is known to be dependable when things go horribly wrong.
Precisely. So the social network is actually holding the safety data that the spreadsheet misses.
Okay, so the algorithm calculates the basic cost, but the network calculates the actual resilience.
That's a great summary. But this macro-level trust, the big network reputation, it does not just exist in a vacuum.
Right, it has to be maintained.
It is maintained or completely destroyed on the micro level every single day in the day-to-day grind.
Which brings us to a really fascinating part of the research. If big reputations are keeping the industry afloat, how does this invisible currency actually exchange hands-on, like a random Tuesday afternoon?
It happens in the smallest moments.
There is this great breakdown of a reply-all email disaster in the research, and it perfectly illustrates how microscopic this game of trust really is.
Oh, the email thread. Yes.
It revolves around something we all dread, right? An email thread gone wrong.
A classic trigger for workplace anxiety.
So the author of the research hits reply all to a standard message. But among the dozens of addresses on the thread, there happens to be a contact they didn't personally know.
And almost immediately, the author gets a phone call from a longtime colleague.
Yeah, and the colleague asks, in this very dry, suspicious tone, why did you include that email?
Now, the author knew they hadn't actively added that address. It was just already buried in the sprawling thread.
Right.
But the crucial detail here is the invisible emotional charge of suspicion carried by that specific question.
Here is where it gets really interesting. We are asked to look at the microscopic space between two very similar questions.
The space between asking, did you add this, and why did you add this?
It is essentially weaponized curiosity. By asking why, they are putting the burden of proof on the author.
Exactly. Asking, did you add this, is just a simple request for information.
Right. Just yes or no.
But asking, why did you add this, assumes guilt. It assumes a hidden agenda. It implies that the author is maneuvering behind the scenes.
I think everyone listening can relate to this. Just think about the universal panic of seeing an aggressively worded Slack message pop up, or getting looped into a tense email thread with your boss.
You instantly feel that microclimate of suspicion.
You really do. And what does it do? It completely slows down your work.
You stop being productive.
Yeah, you stop innovating and you start playing defense. You start documenting every single move just to protect yourself.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is exactly how language functions as the invisible cement of relationships on a project site.
Invisible cement. I love that analogy.
Think about how actual cement works. It starts fluid, it fills the gaps, and it takes time to cure and harden.
Right.
But if it dries in a hostile temperature, like if there's too much tension in the air, it cures poorly. It becomes brittle.
So a choice of words can build a bridge, or it can build a wall.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Under intense pressure, care turns into rigidity. People aren't necessarily trying to be deliberately aggressive. They're just speaking the language of tension.
And the analysts actually tracked this. They came up with this profound metric. On a construction site, productivity isn't just measured in square meters built. It is measured in words per second.
Words per second, it's a brilliant metric.
The small phrases we use create a psychological microclimate, and that dictates how fast the physical work actually gets done.
Because if the microclimate is hostile, the physical work slows to a crawl. Everyone is just double-checking their backs.
Right. Trust lives entirely in that microscopic space between someone's intention and another person's interpretation.
And when the atmosphere on a site or in an office is tense, everything is filtered through a lens of suspicion.
So a simple question about an email address becomes an accusation of corporate espionage.
Basically, yes.
Now, you would think the only way to fix that microclimate of suspicion is to get everyone in a room to hash it out, apologize, and clear the air.
That sounds nice in theory.
Right. But nobody has time for a group therapy session on a construction site with a massive deadline looming.
No, they absolutely don't.
Yeah.
And that is why direct apologies are incredibly rare in these high-stakes environments.
Haste and professional pride speak first.
Always.
Yeah.
But the authors actually tracked how these conflicts get resolved without grinding the project to a halt. And they found a mechanism called a tacit repair.
A tacit repair. We actually see this play out as the follow-up to that tense email incident, don't we?
We do.
After the suspicious phone call, the colleague calls the author back later and simply says, I got to the bottom of the situation. And it turns out there was a mix-up with the email addresses. Someone thought the unknown address belonged to a guy named Jorge the foreman, The guy actually overseeing the physical labor on the site.
Notice what didn't happen in that follow-up call, though.
What's that?
There was no formal apology. The colleague didn't say, "I am so sorry I accused you of having a hidden agenda."
None at all. They just delivered the factual update.
Exactly. In intense, fast-paced environments, the very act of reopening the conversation, of providing the clarification and closing the loop, is the disguised apology.
That is the tacit repair.
Yes, mature leadership means accepting that tacit repair to realign the workflow.
Rather than letting your own ego demand a formal, groveling apology.
You recognize the olive branch for what it is, and you just move on to get the job done.
That tacit repair is a great example of how deep trust keeps a project moving when the pressure is on. But there is a dangerous edge to having that much trust, isn't there?
There really is a dark side to it.
Because when you stop relying on rules and start relying entirely on tacit understandings, you cross a very thin line into favoritism.
The whole system can easily pivot to the dark side. The research warned us about this explicitly.
Trust is powerful, but it is not inherently pure.
Exactly. When deep trust crosses into complicity, the foundation of the project is compromised.
Fernando observes this, actually. He notes cases where personal relationships between contractors and clients are placed way above quality and ethics.
It stops being about, "I trust you to do a good job," and it starts being about, "I trust you to cover for me."
So the buddy system completely replaces the quality control system.
And the consequence of that complicity is just devastating to the broader ecosystem.
How so?
Well, when collusion happens, it breeds a general systemic distrust. And how do organizations respond to systemic distrust?
They panic.
They do. They respond by suffocating the work with bureaucracy. They mandate more audits, more oversight, more endless paperwork.
Oh, right. The very things that slow progress to a crawl and drive up those transaction costs we talked about earlier.
Exactly. The system tries to protect itself, but in doing so, it freezes the work.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? Whether you are managing a skyscraper build or just trying to navigate your department's weekly status meeting, you are walking a really delicate tightrope.
You really are.
You have to balance trust as a fundamental human value. The thing that actually makes work meaningful and efficient, but without letting it turn into a toxic clique or unethical collusion.
You can't replace the human element with the coldness of numbers, but you also can't let the human element blind you to the facts.
Which raises an important question for all of us.
It does. How do you cultivate mutual trust in your own teams so that everyone wins?
Right. How do you create an environment where the client, or your boss, sleeps well at night, where your team delivers their work with pride, and where the individual actually labors with a sense of meaning?
It requires a very conscious effort to manage that invisible cement.
Because without trust, you can pour all the concrete you want, you can put up all the structural walls, but the project will never truly stand firm from within.
The invisible cement is what binds the whole thing together. If it dries in a hostile environment, the structure is brittle.
So true. As you go into your week, we really encourage you to try and observe this invisible game playing out in your own life.
Pay close attention to the subtle word choices in the emails you receive or the ones you send.
Notice the microscopic space between your intention and how someone else might interpret it.
Watch for those moments where a gut feeling completely overrides spreadsheet logic in your own decision-making. You will start seeing the shadow economy everywhere.
It is everywhere, once you know to look for it. But before we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over.
Something that builds on everything we've discussed today.
We have established that trust is fundamentally built on human intuition, tone of voice, shared social memories, and reading the subtle emotional cues of the people around us.
Right. All very human things.
But we are rapidly entering an era where artificial intelligence and automated project management are taking over massive sectors of these industries.
Oh, absolutely.
So what happens to this invisible game then? If an AI is generating the bids, evaluating the risk, and sending the emails, will a machine ever be able to genuinely inspire trust the way Fernando described?
That is the million-dollar question.
Or, by completely removing the messy, emotional human element to achieve perfect efficiency, will we actually cause the invisible foundations of our economy to crumble?
It is a fascinating problem to consider.
Think about that the next time you look at a skyscraper. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you on the next Deep Dive.